The host's eyes moved over him once, top to bottom, and that was all it took. Grease on the cuffs, boots gray with concrete dust, a jacket with a company logo half peeled off from 1,000 washes. Marcus Webb stood at the hostess stand of a restaurant called Larchmont, and he did not move. Behind him, the dinner rush filled the room with soft light and quiet conversation, the clink of glasses, a low hum of people who had never once been looked at the way this host was looking at him now. "I don't think there's a table for you tonight," the young man said, not even bothering to check the reservation screen. "We're pretty full." Marcus glanced past him. Half the tables were empty. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He asked, evenly, if he could speak to the manager. "If you've ever been sized up and dismissed by someone who thought they understood exactly who you were and exactly what you were worth, just from a glance, you already know the feeling sitting in Marcus Webb's chest right now. Stay with this one until the end, because what happens in the next hour to this restaurant and to the man standing behind that podium is going to feel very, very good." Marcus Webb had been a concrete contractor for 19 years. He owned his own company, 6 trucks, a rotating crew of 11 men, and a modest office off Route 9 that he'd built himself, literally, pouring the slab on a Sunday with his daughter watching from a lawn chair and eating a popsicle. He was 44 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Ellie, a wife who had passed 3 years earlier from an illness that had taken 18 months to finish its work, and a life that had rearranged itself since then into a shape built entirely around getting Ellie to school, getting himself to job sites, and getting them both fed and home and settled before the next day started all over again. He did not look like a man who owned anything. That was, in its way, the point. Marcus wore work clothes because he worked. He did not believe in performing wealth, and even if he had, there would have been little occasion for it. His days began at 5 and often didn't end until 7, and on the days when a pour ran long or a crew came up short a man and he had to step in himself, they didn't end until later than that. This particular evening had been one of those. A commercial job downtown, a foundation pour, for a mixed-use building, had run into a rebar inspection delay that pushed everything back 4 hours. Marcus had been on his knees in wet concrete at 6 in the evening, finishing an edge by hand, because the finisher had gone home sick. And by the time he climbed into his truck, his back had the particular ache that came from a day spent almost entirely bent at the waist. He'd called his sister to pick up Ellie from her after-school program, which she'd done 100 times before, and she'd texted him a photo of Ellie doing homework at her kitchen table with a small thumbs up. He'd driven toward home with the intention of picking up something quick, and it was hunger and exhaustion in roughly equal measure that made him pull into the lot of Larchmont instead of the drive-through 2 exits further on. He'd eaten there once before, months earlier, with Ellie, on a rare night when he'd showered and changed before dinner, and the two of them had celebrated the end of her school year with the fanciest meal either of them could think of. He remembered the food being good. He remembered the woman at the front desk that night, being kind to Ellie, sliding her a crayon and a paper placemat without being asked. He did not expect the same warmth tonight, dressed as he was, but he did not expect what he got either. The host, whose name tag read Preston, could not have been older than 26. He had the kind of practiced, dismissive courtesy that some young men in service industries mistake for authority, a way of holding his chin very slightly elevated, a way of letting his eyes do most of the talking before his mouth ever opened. He looked at Marcus's boots first, then his jacket, then briefly his face as if confirming something he'd already decided. "I don't think there's a table for you tonight," he said. "We're pretty full." Marcus had heard variations of this sentence before, in other places, at other times in his life, and had learned that the useful response was rarely the emotional one. He looked past Preston's shoulder at the dining room. He counted, without meaning to, the way he counted rebar or measured a form before a pour. An old habit of an orderly mind. 14 tables, 5 occupied. He didn't mention the discrepancy. He simply said, "Can I speak with the manager, please?" Something flickered behind Preston's eyes, a small irritation at not being obeyed, quickly smoothed over into something closer to satisfaction, the look of a man who believed the coming conversation would only confirm what he'd already concluded. Sure, Preston said, drawing the word out. Let me get her. The manager, a woman in her 30s named Danielle Ford, appeared a minute later with the particular brisk energy of someone interrupted mid-task and mildly annoyed about it. She looked Marcus over with the same swift sorting glance Preston had used, though hers was slightly better disguised, beneath a professional smile. Hi there, what can I help you with? I'd like a table, Marcus said. Your host says you're full. I count 9. Empty. Danielle's smile didn't waver, but something in her posture straightened, the recalibration of someone deciding how much effort a problem deserved. We do hold some tables for reservations this time of night, and unfortunately we do have a dress code we ask guests to observe. It's just part of maintaining the atmosphere our regulars expect. She said this the way people say things they've said many times before, smooth and unbothered. A sentence worn soft at the edges from overuse. Marcus looked down at himself, then back at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not point out that nothing on the wall by the entrance, nor anywhere he could see, actually stated a dress code. He simply said, I understand. Could I speak with the owner then? This time, the flicker of irritation did not stay hidden. The owner isn't here tonight, Danielle said, a little quicker than before. I'm the manager. I make these calls. Then, I'd like their number, or I'd like to wait until they can be reached. There was a pause. Around them a server passed with a tray of drinks, weaving carefully, eyes flicking toward the small standoff at the host stand, and then away again, the practiced non-involvement of someone who needed this job. Sir, Danielle said, and her voice had taken on the particular chill of someone who believed she was being unreasonably tested by a man who had no standing to test her. I really don't think that's necessary. I'd be happy to recommend somewhere more, casual, a couple blocks over. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not for a phone. For a folded sheet of paper he happened to be carrying that night. Printed that morning for an entirely unrelated reason. A lease renewal. Notice his property manager had drafted for his signature regarding a commercial unit he owned 2 towns over. He did not need it for what came next. Not really. But something in him, tired as he was, wanted the moment to be unambiguous. This building, he said quietly, sits on a parcel I own. Larchmont's lease is with a holding company called Ashcroft Property Group. I am Ashcroft Property Group. Danielle Ford's practiced smile did not so much fade as simply stop functioning. The way a machine stops when the power is cut, all at once and completely. I'm sorry. What? I bought this building 11 months ago, Marcus said, along with 4 others on this block. I don't usually mention it because it isn't usually relevant to getting dinner. He folded the paper again and slid it back into his jacket. Tonight, it seems to be relevant. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the kind that settles over a room when everyone present is recalculating, very quickly, every assumption they've been operating under for the past several minutes. Preston, still standing at the podium, had gone the color of the tablecloths. Danielle opened her mouth, closed it, and then said in a voice noticeably smaller than the one she'd used 30 seconds earlier, Mr. Webb, I had no idea. Let me get you a table right away, please. Whatever you'd like, on the house tonight, of course. I don't need a free meal, Marcus said. I'd have paid for it same as anyone. What I'd like is to sit down and eat, the same as I'd have liked 20 minutes ago, before I was told there wasn't room for someone dressed like me. He said this without heat. It was, in its way, the most damning thing about how he said it. There was no triumph in his voice, no relish. He was simply stating what had happened, the way he might describe a measurement that had come out wrong on a job site. A fact, not a feeling. Danielle led him to a table near the window, practically vibrating with the effort of appearing composed, and Marcus sat, ordered a steak and a glass of water, and ate his dinner in the same unhurried, unreadable manner he did everything. He did not gloat. He did not make calls. He did not, even once, look toward the host stand to see whether Preston was watching him. He did, however, take out his phone once his food arrived and send a short text to his property manager, a woman named Carol Ibsen who had handled his commercial leases for 6 years. and who he trusted the way he trusted very few people. The text read, "Need the Larchmont file pulled tomorrow morning. Full review. Something's off with how that location treats people, and I want to know who's responsible before the lease renews." Carol's reply came 20 minutes later, while Marcus was finishing his meal already flagged. 2 late payments from them last quarter. Was going to mention it. Perfect timing, unfortunately. Marcus read that twice. The way he read most things that mattered, an old habit that had served him well over the years, in contracts and in blueprints. Alike, the first read was always for the words. The second read was for what the words implied. 2 late payments. A lease renewal in 90 days. And now, this. He finished his steak, left cash on the table, despite Danielle's repeated insistence that the meal was covered, and drove home to relieve his sister and put his daughter to bed, saying nothing to Ellie about any of it beyond the ordinary tired affection of a father asking about her day. But he did not forget it. Marcus Webb did not forget much of anything. The name Ashcroft Property Group meant nothing to almost anyone who encountered it, which was exactly how Marcus had built it. He was not a man who wanted his name on buildings. He had gotten into commercial real estate almost by accident 6 years earlier, when a small strip of retail units near one of his job sites had gone up for sale at a price so far beneath its actual value that not buying it would have felt like a kind of negligence. He'd paid cash, saved from a decade of underbidding competitors by knowing his actual costs down to the dollar and never padding an estimate to cover his own carelessness. He'd fixed the roof, replaced the parking lot, and rented the units to small businesses at rates fair enough that none of them had ever left. From there, it had grown slowly, the way Marcus built everything, one solid piece laid carefully atop the last. He now owned 9 properties across 2 counties, all under the same quiet holding company, all managed with the same principle that had guided his concrete business for nearly 2 decades. Do the work honestly, treat people fairly, and let the results speak instead of the reputation. Larchmont's building had come into his portfolio the previous year as part of a larger block purchase, 4 connected retail and restaurant spaces that the previous owner, an elderly man retiring to Florida, had sold together rather than parcel by parcel. Marcus had barely thought about the restaurant since Carol handled the lease administration. He handled the buildings themselves, the roofs and the boilers and the parking lots, things he understood in his bones. He had not, until that night, given much thought to what happened inside Larchmont's dining room, or who ran it, or how. That changed the following morning. Carol arrived at his office at 8, a manila folder under her arm, her reading glasses already pushed up into gray hair, that she wore always pinned back in the same practical twist. She was 61, had been managing property portfolios since before Marcus was old enough to drive, and possessed the specific weathered competence of someone who had seen every kind of tenant deception there was to see, and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. "You're going to want to sit down for this," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "Though I suspect you already figured some of it out last night." Marcus sat. He opened the folder and began to read. The lease for Larchmont's space was held by a corporate entity called Larchmont Hospitality Group, which, according to Carol's research, was itself owned by a regional chain called Beckridge Dining Partners, which operated 11 restaurants across 3 states under different names, all designed to feel like independent, locally owned establishments rather than what they actually were. The restaurant's general manager, the woman who oversaw not just Larchmont, but 2 other locations under the Beckridge umbrella, was a man named Gregory Halston. Danielle Ford, the manager Marcus had spoken with the previous night, reported to him. Carol had pulled Halston's history, the parts of it that were public, and it made for an interesting read. Halston had been with Beckridge for 9 years, had a reputation within the small world of regional hospitality management for aggressive cost-cutting, and had, according to 2 lawsuits Carol had found in public court records, been named in complaints alleging discriminatory service practices at 2 previous locations he'd managed. Both suits had settled quietly, out of court, with no admission of wrongdoing, the way such things so often did. "So this isn't new," Marcus said, reading the summary a second time. The way he read most things that mattered. The first pass had been for the facts. The second was for what the facts implied about the man behind them. "It isn't," Carol said. And there's something else. I pulled the payment history like you asked. Larchmont's parent company has been late twice in the past 2 quarters. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger default, but late. Meanwhile, she tapped a second page. Their reported revenue to us, which factors into the percentage rent clause in their lease, has been declining for 5 straight months. Except the location looks busy every time I drive past it in the evening. Marcus set the folder down slowly. You're saying they might be underreporting revenue. I'm saying it's worth finding out, Carol said. Because if they are, that's not just bad service, Marcus. That's fraud against your lease. He sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way he'd turn over a piece of formwork before deciding whether it could bear the weight it needed to bear. There was a version of this, he understood, where he simply let the lease lapse in 90 days, found a new tenant, and moved on without confrontation, without drama, without any of the messiness that came from proving a large company had been lying to him. That was not the version he chose. I want a full audit of their reported numbers against actual receipts, he said. Whatever you can pull legally, point-of-sale records, if their contract gives us access. And I want to know exactly who's making decisions at that location, and how far up this goes. That could take a couple weeks to do properly, Carol said. Then it takes a couple weeks, Marcus said. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just not going to be lied to in a building I own. Carol almost smiled at that, the closest thing to open amusement she allowed herself during business hours. You know, most landlords wouldn't bother. They'd just let the lease die and rent to someone else. Most landlords didn't get told there wasn't a table for them because of their boots, Marcus said, and went back to reading. Over the following 2 weeks, a picture assembled itself the way a foundation assembles itself, layer by layer, each piece meaningless alone and damning together. Carol's audit, cross-referencing point-of-sale data that the lease agreement legally entitled the property owner to review, found a gap between reported revenue and actual transaction volume that ran to nearly 11%, month over month, going back the better part of a year. 11%. Quietly skimmed off the top of numbers that determined how much percentage rent Ashcroft Property Group was owed under the lease. It was not a dramatic number. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be small enough to escape casual notice and large enough, over time, to matter considerably. Marcus had a contractor's respect for numbers that lied quietly rather than loudly. A beam that failed, suddenly, was frightening but honest. A beam that bent slowly, invisibly for years before anyone noticed. That was the kind of failure that actually cost people something. Alongside the financial discrepancy, a second threat emerged, this one uglier and harder to quantify. Carol, working with a young paralegal she sometimes contracted for lease disputes, began quietly gathering accounts from former Larchmont employees, 3 of whom had left within the past 8 months, and were willing to talk once they understood they weren't the ones under investigation. All 3 described a consistent pattern under Gregory Halston's management, one that Danielle Ford and, beneath her Preston, had clearly absorbed and enforced without apparently ever being told to do so in writing. Certain guests, ones who did not fit a particular image of what a Larchmont customer looked like, were to be discouraged, delayed, or turned away outright, using tables held for reservations that did not exist as the excuse. One former server, a young woman named Priya Anand, had actually quit over it 4 months earlier after being reprimanded for seating a family in work uniforms during a slow Tuesday shift. Halston called it protecting the brand, she told Carol's paralegal. In a recorded conversation, Marcus later listened to in full twice the way he listened to most things that mattered. He never put it in an email. He'd just say it in meetings. Look, this is a premium concept. We want people who feel right for the space. Everybody knew what he meant. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, so they didn't. Marcus finished listening to that recording at his kitchen table one night. After Ellie had gone to bed, the house quiet around him. The particular quiet of a home with only 2 people in it, one of them asleep. He thought about the way Preston's eyes had moved over his boots and his cuffs, sorting him in an instant into a category that didn't deserve a table. He thought about how practiced that had felt, how unhesitating the practiced ease of someone repeating a lesson they'd been taught so many times, it no longer felt like a lesson at all, just an instinct. He did not feel angry, exactly. Anger was not really his register. What he felt was closer to the sensation of finding rot behind a wall he'd assumed was sound, the quiet, unpleasant confirmation that something needed to come out before it spread any further. He called Carol the next morning. "I want a meeting," he said. "Not with Danielle Ford, with Halston, and with whoever sits above him at Beckridge, corporate leadership. I want them in a room." "You want to do this formally," Carol said. "It wasn't a question. I want to do this in front of someone who actually has the authority to fix it," Marcus said. "Not the manager, who was just following instructions, the person giving them." Carol made the arrangements over the following week, framing the meeting to Beckridge's corporate office as a standard lease compliance review, the kind of unremarkable administrative meeting that happens between landlords and major tenants without anyone expecting fireworks. She was good at this, deliberately underselling the stakes, and Marcus suspected that Halston, when informed of the meeting, felt nothing more than mild irritation at having his afternoon interrupted. The meeting was set for a Thursday at Beckridge Dining Partners Regional Office, a glass-fronted suite on the 4th floor of an office park 20 minutes from Larchmont itself. Marcus arrived in a gray suit, the only one he owned, the one he wore to Ellie's school events and, 3 years earlier, to his wife's funeral. He had not worn it since. It still fit, more or less, though he'd had to let the waistband out a notch. 19 years of physical labor having reshaped him in ways a suit didn't always accommodate gracefully. Carol walked in beside him, a slim folder under her arm that contained, in careful, methodical order, everything they had found. Waiting in the conference room were 3 people. Gregory Halston, tall, silver-templed, wearing the kind of suit that had clearly cost more than Marcus's truck payment, sat at the head of the table with the loose, confident posture of a man who had never once, in 9 years, been made to answer for anything. Beside him sat Danielle Ford, visibly nervous, her hands folded very precisely on the table in front of her, and at the far end, reviewing something on a tablet, sat a woman Marcus didn't recognize. She was introduced as Renata Beckridge, and the name landed in the room the way names sometimes do, a small ripple of recalibrated attention. She was the founder's granddaughter, 38 years old, and had taken over as chief executive of Beckridge Dining Partners only 14 months earlier, following her grandfather's retirement after 4 decades of building the company from a single diner into a regional chain of 11 concepts. She had, according to what little Carol had been able to find on her beforehand, a reputation within the industry as sharp, private, and largely untested, someone who had inherited both a company and a set of executives who had been running it, in practice, for years before she arrived. She looked up when Marcus and Carol entered, studied them both for a moment with an attentiveness that Marcus recognized, the look of someone actually assessing a room rather than performing an assessment for others to see, and gave a small, polite nod. "Mrs. Ibsen, Mr. Webb, thank you for coming in." Her eyes moved briefly to Halston. "Gregory tells me this is a routine lease review. It started that way," Marcus said, taking a seat. "It isn't anymore." Halston's smile flickered the first small crack. "I'm sorry. What exactly is this regarding?" Marcus did not answer him directly. He looked instead at Carol, who opened her folder and slid 3 copies of a single-page summary across the table, one to Halston, one to Danielle, and one to Renata Beckridge. "3 weeks ago," Marcus said, "I came into Larchmont after a work shift. I was dressed the way I'm dressed most days of my life in work clothes, because I run a concrete company and I'd spent the day pouring a foundation. Your host told me there wasn't a table available. There were 9 empty tables in the room." Danielle's face had gone very still. "When I asked to speak to a manager," Marcus continued, "I was told about a dress code that does not appear anywhere in writing, in your restaurant, on your website, or in any document Mrs. Ibsen has been able to find. When I asked to speak to the owner, I was told the owner wasn't available, which was, in a narrow sense, true, since I was standing in the building at the time, and no one had thought to ask my name." Halston's expression had begun to shift from confusion to something more careful. "Mr. Webb, I want to be clear. If there was some kind of miscommunication with staff, we take that very seriously, and I'm happy to personally—" "It wasn't a miscommunication," Marcus said. "It was policy, unwritten but consistent. I have recorded statements from 3 former employees describing exactly the same practice. Going back at least 8 months, all of them attributing the instruction to you directly. The room went very quiet. Renata Beckridge had not touched her copy of the summary yet. She was watching Halston's face instead, with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating everything they previously believed about a person in real time. "That's absurd," Halston said, and his voice had gone up slightly, the pitch of a man reaching for outrage because the alternative was something closer to panic. "I have never instructed anyone to discriminate against guests. This sounds like disgruntled former staff with an axe to grind. Frankly, and I'm surprised you'd take their word." "Over, there's more," Marcus said, and nodded to Carol. Carol slid a second, thicker document across the table, this one landing directly in front of Renata Beckridge rather than Halston. "This is a comparison," Carol said, "between Larchmont's reported monthly revenue, which determines the percentage rent owed under your lease with Ashcroft Property Group, and the point-of-sale transaction data your own system generated over the same period. We're entitled to review this data under Section 14 of your lease agreement. The gap runs to just under 11%, consistently, for the past 11 months. Halston's face did something complicated. For a moment, the confident smoothness cracked entirely, and what showed beneath it was something closer to calculation, a man rapidly trying to determine how much could still be explained away. "There are accounting adjustments that happen for all kinds of reasons," he said. "Chargebacks, comps, promotional, 11% every month. For 11 months, always in the same direction," Carol said, without raising her voice at all. "That's not noise, Mr. Halston. That's a pattern." Renata Beckridge had picked up the document now and was reading it. Marcus watched her go through it once, quickly, and then again more slowly, the particular motion of someone forcing themselves to absorb something they very much did not want to be true. She set it down. She looked at Halston for a long moment. "Gregory," she said, and her voice was quiet in a way that seemed, to Marcus, considerably more dangerous than shouting would have been. "How long have you known about the revenue gap?" "Renata, I think we should discuss this privately. This isn't the appropriate." "How long?" Halston's mouth opened and closed once before he answered. "There were some adjustments made to smooth reported numbers during a difficult stretch 2 years ago. It was meant to be temporary. It became standard practice. I didn't create the system. I inherited it from the previous regional director, and you kept it running," Renata said. "For 2 years. Skimming revenue that should have gone toward calculating rent owed to the actual property owner. That's not an accounting adjustment, Gregory. That's fraud against a landlord. And depending on how your bonus structure was tied to reported profit margins during that period, it may also be fraud against this company." The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before it. Heavier, the sound of a room's power balance shifting all at once. "And the service practices," Renata continued, turning back to the first document. "The pattern of turning away guests who didn't fit some idea of what this brand should look like. Was that also inherited?" Halston said nothing. "Because I have 3 former employees on record saying it came from you directly," Marcus said quietly. "In meetings, never in writing. Which tells me you knew exactly how it would look if it ever were." Danielle Ford, who had said almost nothing throughout the meeting, spoke up now, her voice unsteady. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Beckridge, I want to say on the record that Gregory did instruct managers directly on this. In quarterly meetings, he used the phrase, 'guests who feel right for the space.' I didn't feel comfortable with it, but I was told it came from corporate messaging on brand positioning, and I didn't feel I had standing to push back. It was," Marcus noted, "not quite an apology, but it was, in its way, the first honest thing anyone besides himself and Carol had said since the meeting began, and he suspected it cost Danielle Ford something to say it in front of the man who had, until 30 seconds earlier, been her superior in every sense that mattered." Renata Beckridge closed the folder in front of her, squared it against the table's edge with a small, precise motion, and looked at Halston for what felt, to everyone in the room, like a considerably longer time than it actually was. "Gregory," she said, "you're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full audit of every location you've overseen for the past 5 years. I want your access to company financial systems revoked before you leave this building. Security will walk you out. Renata, please, let's talk about this like professionals. I built 3 of this company's most profitable. You built 3 locations that turned away paying customers based on how they were dressed, while quietly stealing from a landlord who trusted this company's reported numbers, Renata said. I don't have anything else to discuss with you today. Halston looked for a moment as though he might argue further. Then he seemed to understand all at once that there was no version of the next sentence that would help him, and he stood, gathered nothing, because he had brought nothing worth gathering, and walked out of the conference room with 2 security personnel materializing to escort him, the particular swift. Silent efficiency of a company moving to contain a problem the instant it became undeniable. The room exhaled once he was gone. Renata Beckridge turned to Marcus, and something in her posture had changed, the careful neutrality of the meeting's opening, replaced by something more direct. Mr. Webb, I owe you an apology that a document like this can't really deliver, but I want to say it anyway. What happened to you at that restaurant should never have happened, to you or to anyone, and the fact that it was apparently happening as policy, under my company's name, is something I intend to take very seriously. I appreciate that, Marcus said, but I'd rather see it in what happens next than in what's said today. Renata studied him for a moment, and something that might have been the beginning of respect moved behind her eyes. That's fair, she said. Tell me what you'd want to see. Marcus considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things, turning it over before committing to an answer. A written public policy against discriminatory service practices, distributed to every location with a real reporting channel for staff who see it happening, one that doesn't run through the person who might be the problem, he said. Full restitution on the revenue owed under my lease, recalculated properly, with interest. And Danielle keeps her job if she wants it, because whatever she absorbed from Halston, she was the only person in this room today willing to say something true without being forced to. Danielle looked up at that, something crossing her face that looked almost like relief and almost like shame at feeling relieved. Renata nodded slowly. That's more generous than I expected, given the circumstances. I'm not interested in destroying people, Marcus said. I'm interested in things being run honestly. Those aren't always the same goal, but today they happen to line up. Over the following 10 days, Marcus watched the changes unfold with the same patient attention he brought to a job site, checking each stage before allowing the next to proceed. Beckridge Dining Partners issued a company-wide policy, drafted with input from an outside labor attorney, explicitly prohibiting service refusals based on appearance, along with a confidential reporting line that routed directly to Renata's office, rather than through regional management. The revenue discrepancy at Larchmont was recalculated in full, and Ashcroft Property Group received a corrected payment, with interest, that arrived exactly on the date Carol had specified in the lease's compliance clause, not a day late. Halston's suspension became within 3 weeks, a formal termination, once the broader audit of his 5 years, overseeing multiple locations, turned up patterns similar to what had been found at Larchmont in at least 2 other restaurants. Marcus read the summary of that outcome once, briefly, and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction so much as the plain, unremarkable relief of watching a problem get solved correctly. Danielle Ford kept her position as manager. Marcus visited Larchmont once more, 3 weeks after the meeting, this time in the same work clothes he'd worn the first night. Deliberately, Preston was still working the host stand. When Marcus walked in, the young man's face went through several stages in quick succession: recognition, alarm, and then something more careful, before he stepped out from behind the podium and said, quietly, "Mr. Webb, right this way, please. Any table you'd like." "Thank you," Marcus said, and left it at that because there was nothing else that needed saying, and because he had learned a long time ago that some corrections did not require an audience to be real. He sat by the window this time, the same table as before, and ordered the same steak and ate his dinner slowly without hurry in a dining room that felt, for the first time since he'd walked into it, like a place that had actually earned the quiet, ordinary dignity it had always pretended to have. Danielle stopped by his table near the end of the meal, not performing anything, simply pausing. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you said in that meeting about my job. You told the truth when it would have been easier not to." Marcus said. That's worth something. I try to reward it when I see it. She nodded, and there was a brief, unforced quiet between them, the kind that exists between two people who have arrived from very different directions at a similar understanding of what had happened. 2 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, Marcus stood in the driveway of his house with a level in one hand, checking the pitch of a small concrete pad he'd poured for a shed Ellie wanted for her bicycles, when a car he didn't recognize pulled up along the curb. Renata Beckridge climbed out, dressed considerably more casually than she had been at their first meeting, in jeans and a plain jacket, and approached with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure her visit was welcome. "I hope this isn't intrusive," she said. "Carol mentioned you lived out this way, and I was driving through for a location visit, and I wanted to follow up in person rather than over email. It felt like the kind of thing that deserved that." Marcus set the level down. "It's not intrusive." She glanced around the yard, the small, orderly house, the neat rows of tools in the open garage, the shed frame taking shape beside them, and something in her expression suggested she was recalibrating something again, the way she had in the conference room months earlier, except gentler this time, more personal. "I wanted you to know the audit's complete," she said. 2 other locations had similar issues, smaller in scale, but real. Both have been corrected, and the reporting line has already been used 4 times by staff at different restaurants. Every complaint has been handled directly without going through regional management first. "Good," Marcus said. "I also wanted to ask you something," Renata said, and there was a small hesitation in it that hadn't been present in her voice during the meeting, something more uncertain and more human. "The company's board has been discussing creating an independent compliance and ethics position, someone with no financial stake in day-to-day operations, reporting directly to the board rather than to regional management. Someone who audits fairness and integrity across the properties, the way you audited the numbers on your own lease. I'd like you to consider taking it." Marcus looked at her for a moment, then glanced toward the house, where he could hear faintly Ellie narrating something to her stuffed animals through the open window, an entire imagined world running its course in a small bedroom on a quiet Saturday afternoon. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I've got a concrete company, a portfolio of buildings I take care of properly, and a daughter who needs me at her school things more than she needs me in a boardroom. I'm not looking to trade one for the other." Renata nodded as though she'd half expected that answer and respected it more for being expected. "What if it wasn't full-time?" she said. What if it was structured the way you'd structure anything else, on your own terms, quarterly reviews, full authority to investigate anything, anywhere in the company, answerable only to the board, not to management. You set the hours. You set the scope." Marcus considered this for a long moment, the way he considered most things that mattered, turning it over before committing to anything. "I'd want it in writing," he said finally. "Real authority, not a title. And I'd want it clear from day one that I don't work weekends, and I don't work past 5 on a school night, because that time belongs to my daughter, not your company." "I can put that in writing," Renata said, and something in her voice suggested she meant it, not as a concession, but as something closer to relief. The relief of someone who had spent over a year surrounded by people who valued appearances and had finally found someone who didn't. They shook on it there, in the driveway, the level still lying in the grass beside them, the shed frame half finished, the ordinary late light of a Saturday afternoon settling over a small, unremarkable house that had, without any fuss at all, quietly reshaped the ethics of a company with 11 restaurants and several thousand employees. Ellie came out onto the porch a few minutes later, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices, and studied Renata with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a 7-year-old assessing a stranger. "Are you Dad's friend?" she asked. Renata glanced at Marcus, a small, genuine smile crossing her face for what seemed like the first time all afternoon. "I think I might be," she said. Marcus picked the level back up, checked the pitch of the pad one more time, found it true, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Some things, he had learned a long time ago, spoke plainly enough on their own, if you simply did them right and let them stand.